Alright, this is video number 4, hip subluxation in cerebral palsy, and this one is titled Hip Subluxation, Why So Much Attention? The Truths and the Myths. You see, it's a difficult subject in the sense that I wish I could have just go to the pictures, show things, get a simple explanation, get simple answers on the questions that have been asked, but the essence here is that we really have to go through a lot of the background work to clarify all the definitions and all, like the implied things and so on, before we can actually make a true picture of the situation. So in the previous videos, I've linked things to the, first two, right? I've linked them to the overall transformation and tried to give you the larger picture. I don't know whether it's the most convenient format for you or not, but that's the true thing, right? I linked it to the past. Then, linked into the larger context. And the video number 3, I went with this important definitions of what the subluxation is and whether you understand it in the same way as the medical profession, right? So you see, that's where we arrive to the difference between the local X-ray understanding and the extended sort of live understanding that you have as a parent. But this video we're going to take an extra angle and actually go more in an extra level of concrete detail in order to deconstruct the myths and kind of this entire scare and try to understand what is the basis or what are the key elements that are being discussed in relation to hip subluxation, so that what are the key worries, what are the key kind of fundamental concerns and importances, if I can say so, right? Okay, so let's move on. So that's my first question. That's the first question that I've always asked. Why so much fuss, right? On the one hand, it's like, if you think about it, there are, over 200 joints in the body, right? And then when you look at the person, for instance, looks like this, and has no counterbalancing whatsoever, who has no strength, who has no head control and so on, it's a natural question that comes up if you just get out of this zoom onto the legs and so on, which drawn by the desire to put the channel in the legs. And then, why out of more than 200 joints in the body, it's so much focus on the hip joint, so much focus on this subluxation issue. So that's my first question, right? But I understand that on the other hand, that's a reality. Subluxation is a big point, right? And when I hear, even from a very attentive, very focused mother, that I'm worried about the hip subluxation, subluxation is my biggest concern, right? So when I hear that, I say, okay, let's try to find out what is the essence, right? Let's kind of make the list of all the challenges that are typically associated with this and why there is so much focus on that. So, as I said, that's the fact. Subluxation is my biggest concern. Let's try to deconstruct and understand what's behind it. First of all, there are two avenues of reasoning, two avenues of two mindsets here. First mindset is a defensive mindset, meaning that what are the potential negative consequences, like the deterioration signs that tend to go as an avalanche, to say so, once the subluxation has established. So this is one of the big points, that thinking it's been moved into a popular opinion, or it's in a popular perception, that subluxation, once it's there, it just marks this critical stage where everything that happens afterwards just goes with accelerated pace in the direction of deterioration. So let's go one by one over these elements, and I'm just going to go through them quickly first. So first scare, right? First scare which is being used here, or which is being often enough is sort of self-inflicted, and on the other hand comes from the experience of knowing other kids with subluxations, right? So that's the issue of pains. Very much understandable. I believe that most of the parents, especially quadriplegic kids, that's the greatest scare. Linking subluxation with pains, plus bearing in mind that orthopedic profession or even physical therapists use these scare tactics left and right and put a lot of pressure on this, saying that, well, if you don't do something about the subluxation, well, your child is going to end up with terrible pains. I'm not saying anything about whether it's legitimate or not and how it's going to be addressed, but just making the list. So the second part, I believe that a lot of people actually being very worried about is the perception that subluxation is going to be responsible for permanent shortness of the legs, that the leg length discrepancy is there to stay and it's being the product of the subluxation. So valid point in the sense that, well, scary enough, right? Next thing, dislocation, a femur head necrosis. Well, maybe not so much for the individual parents, well, in the sense that you can't really visualize the femur head necrosis, but depends on how sort of aggressive is the orthopedic surgeon that you meet, because typically that's the key point that they pressurize for, that if we don't do the early interventions, so-called early interventions, then everything is going to end up with profound deterioration and just going to be a complete collapse. Like for instance here, right? Yeah, I'm taking the slide from the conference back in, well, a year and a half ago, right? In 2 years now, right? In Sydney. So that's the slide that has been used routinely there to pressurize and to sort of sell the issue of the hip surgeries, saying that, well, if you don't do the hip surgery, if you don't pay attention to subluxation, your child is going to end up like this. Well, again, the message here, as if you kind of bring the association that that's the subluxation, which then kind of radiates all around and then causes all that. But that's that element that is being used frequently. Next part, crossing. So crossing itself is something that obviously related to the idea and to the issue of their management difficulties, and it's kind of a package of things, right? On the one hand, you see it's a mix of elements. On the one hand, crossing is something that you deeply associate with the profound cerebral palsy, right? When you think of a, say, teenage child, the way they look, the way that their natural outcome goes, you visualize these crossed legs. And that's the very word crossing has acquired such a stigma, and I mean it's very painful to think about it for you as a parent. That's very much understandable. So therefore, staying out of crossing, that's being such a big point for so many people. And again, it's understandable. The emotional charge behind it is understandable. I've seen so many people doing just, getting into this position and sort of saying, oh, like the child takes this neutral position. The moment the child does it, they rush, grab the leg, put it aside and say, oh, at least it stays on the side. It's irrational because that's neutral situation here. And, you have to understand these basics. Everything within the body is logical, meaning that the body always looks for the least expensive position. So if crossing is the least expensive position in terms of the total combined muscular tension and so on, it's going to be taken. no matter how frequently you actually try to put the legs in a straight position, because it's a fake straightness, right? So again, think of the aqua park ride, the twists and tubes and so on, and then you trying to straighten it. Doesn't make sense. But anyway, the emotionally charged issue here is understood on the one hand from the emotional perspective. On the other hand, yes, of course, crossing and the limitations, difficulties with abduction create difficulties in handling, and potentially it also could be the source of pains, right? And especially things like whatever, changing diapers, having bathing, going on the toilet handling, hygiene and so on. Understandable. So again, this is something that is typically being associated with the subluxation. And one more point here in this particular thing is the inability to stand. So that's another big one, because standing is something that is being given so much emotional value, no matter how bad it is. Still, I can see parents like trying to force their kids and all sorts of supports, but just somehow looking like standing, and just at the same time always uncrossing the legs. So these are the things that charged emotionally. So therefore, this is the first notion, is very straightforward. If one thinks of the hip subluxation, the very straightforward image is that, well, there is no match between the head and the acetabulum, right, between the head and the roof. So the expectations are, if the leg is subluxed, then expecting anything good in standing. The profound difference between this picture and say this picture is very obvious, right? So standing, visualizing that, boom, the moment if the subluxation is there, then the legs are going to pop out under the loads. Very big motivating selling point for the proponents of the fight with subluxation. So next point, obviously, leg shortness withdrawal, because in many cases what you see with the profound crossing, then of course it's hard to imagine how the child could actually stand, because the leg is being withdrawn, right? So the short leg, you naturally tend to think, okay, if the leg is short, how on earth can one stand, right? So here, of course, we can see that the reality is a lot more complex than that. But when, as a parent, you look at this picture, say, okay, at least the feet are sort of touching the ground and they are not being withdrawn, right? So you see, she's able to put 2 feet in touch with the ground at the same time. So getting out of this, right, getting to the point when 1 foot sort of gets withdrawn, of course, it's a major psychological aspect. And then seeing again, it's in package with this leg shortness, seeing the severe supercrossing, that's another part, right? So being unable to uncross the leg obviously makes very obvious, even for a person who doesn't have any sort of too much of thinking background about it. Just you look at it and say, okay, if the legs are crossed, then you can't really walk, right? So this is defensive mindset. That's what people think about as the negative sides of their development of subluxation, or kind of accumulation, aggravation of subluxation. And these are the things which create the concerns. So then there are a few elements which actually come with the proactive mindset, meaning that the idea of even surgical, shall I say, not, okay, let's call it correction, right? Surgical fiddling with the leg and artificial insertion of the leg back in the well, somewhere around the acetabulum. So the message here is that, well, if the subluxation is corrected, then a child can have the benefits of weight bearing. And then the moment you put a child in the weight bearing position, then good things would happen. For instance, you put the child like this, and then somehow from this weight bearing, boom, 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 it's going to find the loads in the hip joint so that the bones are going to get properly formed and shaped and so on. And the osteoporosis is not going to. So it's, again, the message that comes in a positive way, right? Saying that if you correct the subluxation, then you will be able to get the weight bearing. So the same story goes with sitting correctly. The message that comes from the orthopedic profession, although that's really difficult to sort of take on board, but anyway, the message that comes from them is that the moment you correct the subluxation, the platform that the child sits on is going to get so much better, then it's going to help with the scoliosis prevention as well. So these are the this is a list of messages which are being typically sent in relationship to subluxation. I guess now we have to distinguish here the truths from myths and to distinguish what things are of, say, true importance and what are being artificially peddled, because the person who thinks or who has a hammer tends to look for the nails, right? So before we move on, I just want to remind this, right? What we talked about in the previous video. You as a parent tend to think of the subluxation in the extended way, tend to think of it live, the total package, the pelvis above, below, and so on. That's where you see various types of wrongs. That's how we got, say, 23 observations in a 6-minute video. Then the orthopedic profession and the unfortunate situation that the physical therapists are just locked as their underlings, when they say subluxation, they selectively and narrowly confine it to this particular point and to the 33% mark. So that's what I want you to remember. And once we remember this, the first issue, the most emotionally charged issue, the pains. And then there is a simple question, very straightforward question. Where do the pains come from? What are the potential sources of pains, right? So it's quite straightforward. There are pains that can come from the joint itself, so it's a first source. And there are the pains that can come from the soft tissues, muscles, adductor, hip flexor, hamstrings on the other side. So all sorts of, like, there are 30 muscles converging over the femur. So that's number 2, soft tissues. And it's important to understand that in reality, this bone-based or like deterioration of the joint-based pains, actually they are associated with a condition like this. So the child has to be in such a poor, like completely neglected shape to experience any sort of this hip or femur head necrosis or the respectively the pains that come from the direct bone-on-bone contact. So this is, let's put it realistically. You are responsible parents. You take care of your kids. They are well nourished. They are well looked after, and so on. This is a neglected kid. So for him, yes, if the child is going to be neglected, well, all sorts of things could happen. So it's important to understand that in reality, the pains They can come from the soft tissues. Yes, short muscles, they are potential sources of pains. And if we look at this and say, well, do we see potential candidates here, right? Do we see the elements, do we see the components, the muscles which can potentially be tight enough that they would hurt? Yes, of course there are there. You see, hamstring, tight as a string. This one, tight as a string. Hip flexor here, very rigid. Think about the adductor on this side. These are the extremely short muscles, right? And you can see here that once the leg is being moved, yes, there is no extensibility of the posterior surface of the leg. The entire source of movement comes from the folding at the abdominal level. So muscles themselves, they have no extensibility, to say so. So the issue here, yes, they are potentially capable or potentially at risk of developing discomforts, pains, and so on. But we have to ask a question. This comes from the extended definition. Muscles are soft tissues. And now, the soft tissues, they're dependent on so many things, right? If you look here, there are so many connections, so many elements, so many links that they have that you can't see them on the X-ray. The X-ray shows you hard substance. You can only see bones. The subluxation is a definition that comes from the measurement of the position of the bones. Now, a very straightforward logical question. Why do you want to make any conclusions about the muscles, about the soft tissues, via this strange journey of trying to study the X-ray? X-ray is about the hard substance, and yes, sometimes there is a remote likelihood of with a neglected child that yes, there could be a complete direct conflict and bone-on-bone deterioration. Yes, but this is such a tiny case, it's super unlikely to happen to your child. He has to be so malnourished, so depleted, so deteriorated for this to happen. You're not the kind of parent like this. So, that's my first message. Yes, muscles are at risk, but muscles have nothing to do with this potential pains and discomforts. To understand the potential for them, to understand where those elements could come from, where these discomforts could come from, we don't need the X-ray, we don't need the definition of subluxation. We just, instead of going for all these lengths and then, dance around with the poisons and knives, well, we just have to look at them and say, well, can we do something? Do we have the tools of dealing with muscles, even if they undergo certain periods when all the bypasses are gone, right? When, for instance, the abdomen holds well, but the muscle is still relatively short. Do we have the tools of dealing with it? Yes, we do. So in that sense, you have to think not in terms of the subluxation. You have to think in terms of the muscles. Yes, there are candidates here. And if we look here, if we look at these legs that we have seen a year ago, and we look at these legs, well, these legs are larger, these legs are softer, these legs are rounder. So they are less likely to show pains than these legs, because this is extreme stiffness. So this is my first point. Yes, the pains are the true and legitimate concern, but unless your child is completely neglected, these pains are potentially going to come only from the soft tissues. And the soft tissues, we can deal with them without recruiting the help of the surgeon. That's one line, right? But at the same time, it works the other way around. If you look at this, these kids, they had surgery, but actually they had more pains and discomforts at the end. They don't have subluxation in the formal sense of word, right? They don't have the subluxation anymore in this sense. In the narrow medical sense, there is no subluxation. But if we ask ourselves, do they have a distortion in the extended sense? Yes, they are. They do have it, right? And they, of course, they experience all sorts of discomforts because, well, you still have all these short muscles and so on. So you see how the orthopedic profession kind of brings you towards this bionic man. For them, they say, okay, now we take the subluxation, sort of, we've done this, but, oh, surprise, right? The soft tissues are still in poor condition. So what do they want to do? They say, well, let's do more. Let's do more cutting, let's do more injections, let's do more sort of surgical interventions, chop, cut, and so on. Now, this is, as I said, a bionic perspective. And this is what I mentioned even back then, right, in the this talk to medical professionals. So this is the ideal. This is the ideal picture that's being officially presented at the conferences. They want your child to be like this. So that's the definition of normality. Everything fused, everything put together, and then whenever there is some muscle kind of surfaces up and gets alive, boom, there is a Botox injection and there is a poison that goes in it. So that's the image. The fact that it's not compatible with any potential for development, nobody cares here. Next point, permanent leg shortness. Probably we can discuss it together with crossing because they are kind of working together. But let's look at it again. I said it before, I'll say it over and over and over. The pelvis is the stem for two legs, but the pelvis in itself is connected to the upper body. So this is the drawing, the stem and two branches coming out of it. Now, the thing is that any conversation about the shortness as such does not make much sense until we've really cleared what's happening above the pelvis. So this is my constant message. Look, with the abdomen like this, yes, inevitably there's going to be a difference, discrepancy and so on. Because if you look all around, you're going to see that the entire body is twisted. Everything is twisted. It is impossible to make even put this child on the side flat and straight. She doesn't have enough of this side. She doesn't have enough of the depth. She's twisted all the way from the top. Now, if you have a twist that goes all the way, if it's a corkscrew effect, it's inevitable that you're always going to end up having one leg going out and the other leg going in. So the leg which is on the side that rolls in, that leg is going to be shorter. The leg which is on the side that is going out, this leg is going to be longer. This is not a rocket science, right? You don't need any x-rays to understand it. It's like written here. You see this leg, the right leg has a tendency to go in because the whole thing, the entire body is twisted that way. So then the pelvis as a stem is twisted that way. So therefore this leg, which is on the side of the that rotates first and that goes into the internal rotation, the top leg to say so, this leg is going to be shorter. And this leg, which is on the outside, this leg is going to be longer. We look at her, that's the picture. Let's have a look at another one. You look here, you see the same story. This is the leg, you see it's a different rotation here, right? In her case, it's the other way around. So it's a clockwise rotation, not counterclockwise rotation. So in this case, it's the left leg that is turned in and the right leg that is turned out. Now the left leg is going to be short, the right leg is going to be longer. But this is a very straightforward thing. It's like when you tighten the screw, it moves. You move the nut on a bolt, it travels. You just turn it transversely, right? So you see, as you turn the nut on a bolt, right? Ping, ping, ping. That's the bolt, for instance, right? So you see with some things. And then you put the nut on it, and then you start turning the nut, and the nut travels down. Or you turn it the other way, it goes up. So that's the importance of the understanding of the whole picture. You have to untwist the pelvis. Otherwise, if you don't untwist the pelvis, you end up with the medical thinking. Medical thinking is all about chopping something which is not fit. So you see, you end up with this. You end up with this philosophy. Let's chop a piece of the leg and let's try to balance them by sort of connecting metal rods. So once you understand that principle, that's exactly the case that you can see here, right? So that's the right leg that's going in, and that's the left leg that goes out. But now they are just a lot more movable than before, because that's the old situation. This is a completely depleted pelvis, and this is completely flat, stiff back. So the pelvis was restricted. The pelvis has to compete. So you see, the twist of the pelvis competed with the rigidity of the back. So therefore it was a rusty nut, to say so, right? And once the rust has been cleared, well, the nut just went into its natural position. The least expensive. Of course, over here, she doesn't cross the legs. How could she? She has extreme stiffness on the back, flatness of the back. She has a tilted pelvis that goes forwards, but most importantly, she has this. She has this. So entire pelvis is so flat, it just doesn't allow anything for the legs. Right? It's just the legs it doesn't stop them at all. So effectively, the abdomen, the legs, they work from the same stem. So it's the pelvis itself which is being so weak, so shallow, that the legs are in permanent tendency to drop out, both of them. But on the other hand, the moment there is an added depth, that's it. Each of the legs becomes movable selectively under the pelvis, and then we can see a true picture. The right leg shows its original tendency to go in, the left leg shows the tendency to go out. So I want you to go a little bit further and a little bit beyond this understanding, this narrow understanding. Crossing is something to be feared of. Crossing is a crossing. It's just, it's just a demonstration of the presence of internal rotation, nothing else. But you have to understand that the good crossing in that sense has to come from below the pelvis, not from above. And what you usually fear with the CP kids is supercrossing. And supercrossing is the situation when out of this extreme weakness then comes the next twist, right? So basically, the more she's being exposed to loads, then instead of the movement at the bottom here under the pelvis, eventually this combined package becomes so unified within it, then the twist goes up into the body. And then the pelvis gets even more disrupted. This whole is like the pelvic floor gets completely disconnected, and then as a result of this, we move from that level, from the abdomen level, into the rib cage level. Once that happens, then the legs, instead of following these lines that they follow now, they would follow those lines, and that's how one leg is going to cross one another in the worst scenario that you are able to see in these scary pictures. You see, this crossing comes from the back. It comes with the back distortion. It comes from the way that the twist comes up. Again, this is not what you are facing. This is not the challenge that you're facing now, because actually, if anything, the abdominal space increases, so the twist of the pelvis becomes less pronounced. Next thing, standing. So I don't intend to go into too much of details here, but I just want to understand one simple point. Two issues that are being peddled routinely by medical profession: foot contact and lack of crossing. They make such a tiny part or such a tiny influence on the entire kind of large set of elements which define the weight bearing, so they're negligible. So the fact that her legs are spread here, they are irrelevant, because what happens is that the legs are unable to take any loads. Whenever she's being put in contact with the ground, what happens? It's the abdomen that folds. So I can only say, please don't bug yourself with standing until you have earned some sitting and some quadruped position. You can look at this. So the legs, they don't have any specific reactions. They don't have any ground reaction whatsoever. They're just passively following. So in this particular scenario, there is no point even meaningfully considering and talking about standing. You have to earn the right to talk about standing by building the foundation for it. The person who sits like this cannot stand. See, look at this. For her, the pelvis sinks into the abdominal space. How on earth this pelvis is going to take any loads? This is a very, very straightforward thing. But again, straightforward the moment you start looking at live person. Unfortunately, and I'm going to go briefly over this. You see, these pictures, they are taken from the classic textbook, Physiology of the Joints, by this French gentleman Capangi. He's an orthopedic surgeon, but probably the smartest orthopedic surgeon who ever graced the surface of the earth. By far the smartest. So his textbooks, they're like being in print for the last 40 years. Nothing better ever came in. And he pays incredible attention to detail. He has, all the illustrations, I believe they're done by himself. So it's incredible book. But even when you look at this book, what do you find? Chopping. As if these parts, they don't participate in any weight transfer. And you look at this girl and you look at her struggles and you say, geez, where the heck do you see it? Where is the leading movement? And the leading movement is folding in the abdomen. It's not the hip. It has nothing to do with the orientation of the hip. Her primary challenge is above, not below. She's not moving below at this point. It's like, as if this entire part, legs plus the pelvis, they were just floating on the sea. So, again, that moves beyond the scope of this explanation, but this is what I want you to understand. Please realize that standing is such a complex thing that you have to deserve it. And therefore, that's where, when I hear this stuff, when the orthopedic surgeons switch from scaring, right, so trying to scare you with pains or dislocation or whatever, and move to the sort of useful advice, you have to do the weight bearing to improve the hip. This is just ultimate bullshit, of the person who have never ever bothered to change the scope of the perspective and actually instead, because you see the way that they look at the situation, right? They look like this. They take this and actually put this X-ray into the reality, right? They put this X-ray into the real life. And as I said, even the best of them, they do the same thing. So that's the unfortunate reality. They're not looking at the entire body. But I also want you to get back to this explanation that I gave earlier in the beginning about this movement of the leg, that range of motion, and the conventional interpretation of movement, that's the key challenge on the way to understand. So I must say that I'm myself being inundated by the number of the things that I have to explain, and probably, you know, like this thing I have to cover in a separate video, the conversation about the weight bearing and the way that it works. But the last thing I want to cover here is sitting correctly and scoliosis prevention. When I heard about this, I couldn't believe myself. When somebody says that this girl sits poorly because of the subluxation at the right hip, I can't understand it, right? It's just like, how compartmentalized, how selective, how, I don't know, zoomed like this one's vision have to be in order to miss the point that there is an obvious sinking of the pelvis into the rib cage and into the entire posterior abdominal space. So no matter what you put under her bum, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. What matters is what's above. Only once we have something above, only once we have been able to turn the situation upside down and say, well, this is the framework of the support. This is the support. And then that's the pelvis which is being inserted, right? You see, this is the support. And this is the added element. So if this component, if the pelvis sinks into the posterior abdominal space and into the rib cage from behind, what's the point talking about the legs? How on earth you can actually think that the legs, fiddling with the legs and doing some cutting to them is going to help? So that's mind-boggling. I can't understand it, I must admit. But the fact is that it's not whether I can understand it or not. It's the question that this lack of understanding leads to this. So these are the people in the best and the most advanced country, like Holland, right? With the greatest percentage of the movement specialists per capita, they get this. So that's what I want you to realize, right? And yes, I could sound sometimes arrogant, sometimes I could sound as if I'm too sort of protracted and go around and so on and so on. But I want you to see a larger picture. Because we have to go post-conventional. We have to go out of this loop. Because otherwise, it's self-reinforcing. And if you start following the classic sort of logic, it's just locked within itself. You see, as I said, the unfortunate reality is that when you say that subluxation is my biggest concern, it shows that you still need to work on realizing and understanding what's going on. That you have to really truly get the next level of understanding and taking on board what's happening. So this is my point. So this is the central message from this particular video. That from the perspective of defensive mindset, don't be afraid. Pains, they are the product of the soft tissues. Soft tissues have to be analyzed live, not via the X-ray. And soft tissues deserve specific soft tissue work. Cutting bones is not going to help them. Making poison injections is not going to help them in the long run. Permanent leg shortness, you have to understand that before you talk about the leg shortness, as it's inserted in the pelvis is the total twist of the pelvis and sinking of the pelvis into the rib cage space. I want you to keep thinking like this, right? Think that way. If you have this understanding that this portion, right, went too far down into the rib cage space, it sunk in, it's obvious that the pelvis is going to, that whatever grows out of the pelvis is going to be challenged that way. So it's going to just reflect this sinking. You can't expect proper length and proper orientation of the legs if the entire package sinks into the abdominal space. So, inability to stand, I talked about it here briefly, I'll talk about it more. So, scares are not that scary, and on the other hand, proactive things like the importance for weight bearing, sitting correctly and so on, in the large context, that makes sense. In the large context, yes, you have to improve the entire situation to achieve these goals, to achieve weight bearing, to achieve correct sitting and so on. But it doesn't come from this narrow understanding. So, narrow understanding doesn't help you. Then if you actually deconstruct the whole thing to the specifics, you're going to find out that, well, all the elements are addressable and there is no reason for you to get sort of overly agitated about it. Okay, that's it. So I hope that this helps. I'm open for questions. I'm searching for words and expressions, and I'm going to try it into several more videos. So trying to find the format and the way and the angle that is going to help you to understand these things better and more, and sort of to click on this. Thank you very much for being with me for this protracted and sort of set of ramblings and musings, and I hope that at least you get some benefit and help from it, and at least it's going to help you to ask maybe some more specific questions and so on.